next couple topics, we're going to be talking about fishing. So let's define this term fishery. It's one you may not be familiar with. But a fishery is basically a population of commercially harvestable fish that are within a given region. And fisheries can be vulnerable to the concept of the tragedy of the commons. Because fisheries in the open ocean are generally unregulated, then individual companies are able to exploit those fisheries at a level that's unsustainable. The fish that are in the open ocean, they don't belong to any specific country or person. And so competition for that fish between different commercial fishing organizations has led to huge declines in fisheries over time. And so that overfishing can lead to the loss of those fisheries, but also to non-targeted fish species. We call those bycatch. That impacts biodiversity. It also is disruptive to people whose culture and livelihood have been based on small-scale fishing. And one common example of this overfishing is the Atlantic Northwest cod. Atlantic Northwest cod are a fishery that is present in the northern parts off the coast of Newfoundland in Canada. And this was a fishery that had been used by small-scale coastal Canadian people fishing for 500 years or so. And so before the 1960s and 70s, most of this was relatively small-scale commercial fishing. And the peak of harvest of these fish was around 1968 or so. And we can see what happened in this fishery is that the blue line represents the harvest, the capture of Atlantic Northwest cod, the fishery we're talking about, in millions of tons. In Canada, in blue, and you can see that here, and other countries are in green. And so what you see, I'm trying to see if I can get the scale there. Okay. So what we see is that for most of history, the Canadian capture of Northwest cod was relatively stable and relatively sustainable. But changes happened in basically technology that led to the over-exploitation of this fishery. And some of the changes that happened, I'm going to go back and forth a little bit. Some of the reasons for this, some of the technology were increased levels of ability to find fish, larger scale harvesting of fish, and also the ability to keep fish on board frozen for long periods of time. And so these technologies made large scale harvest easier, and that led to this overfishing of the fisheries. And so here's a list of some of these technologies. So the advent of freezer tankers, so fishing vessels that could capture large amounts of fish but also then freeze them on board, was a major technology advance. It allowed these boats, these large-scale commercial boats, to stay at sea for much longer, months at a time, allowing them to harvest more and more fish. Previous to the advent of this technology, basically you would catch fish, you'd have to return to shore pretty quickly because those fish were not frozen. They were fresh, and they had to be offloaded for sale pretty quickly. And so those freezing ships were a major impact. The use of radar, drones, helicopters allowed these fishing vessels to locate fish more easily. And the size of these fishing operations increased drastically. So there's different ways of catching fish, and they're shown in this diagram. You have a purse seine, where basically you lower a net, raise it up, and capture fish. We could see a purse seine here capturing large amounts of fish. Trawling is dragging a net along the ocean floor and capturing fish. Gill nets are a different type of netting where you also capture fish get trapped in this longer net. And then there's long lines which catch fish on hooks. And these have various impacts that we can talk about. But one of the advent of what were called super trawlers happened in the Northwest Atlantic cod fishery that led to this over harvest that led to the crash of the fishery. And these super trawlers, not only did they catch large amounts of Atlantic Northwest cod, they also captured lots of unintentional fish. And we call that bycatch. The fish that are being captured that are actually not the target fish, that are not going to be sold, that's called bycatch. And so unintentionally capturing large numbers of these other species can be extremely damaging to the ecological stability of the ecosystem. They can be endangered species, that can be keystone species, they can be species that form the basis of the food chain. And when you capture those fish, it can be disruptive to the entire food web in those ecosystems. Also, some of these nets that drag along the seabed, like these trawlers, like these gill nets, they can do physical damage to species. They can stir up sediment that makes it more difficult for fish to get oxygen from the water. They could damage sea life that's anchored to the ocean floor. So these are all impacts that can happen by using some of these new technologies. Now, there are ways using different types of nets to target species and to try to limit bycatch. One of the main ways of doing this is by fishing with nets of different sizes. So if you're targeting large fish, having large openings in the net can allow you to capture larger fish while allowing smaller bycatch to get through those nets. So that's one important factor in how you target certain species. But if we go back to this Atlantic Northwest cod, we can see a crash here. Around in the end of the 1970s and into the 1980s, we see a drastic decline in species. By 1992, the catch of Atlantic Northwest cod was about 1% of the traditional in the previous historic catch of Atlantic cod. So it had crashed at that point. And we can see that this decline happened precipitously and happening to Canadian fishing vessels as well as other countries. And basically this fishery was completely depleted. Not only depleting the population of these fish, but also impacting the livelihood, the culture of the smaller scale fisher people that lived in these coastal areas. The graph at the right shows sort of overall some ideas about fisheries. And so we see obviously a timeline, and again, we see that the decline of these fisheries coincides with some of these advances in fishing technology. So in 1950, 85% of fisheries, this is around the world, were being fished in a sustainable manner. The catch was sustainable, and only about 15% were harvested at the maximum sustainable limit. And then as time went on, those fisheries that were underexploited drastically decreased. The amount being exploited at the maximum possible level that's sustainable declined. And then we see the overexploited fisheries began as a very small percentage of fisheries, but has grown. And so now if we look at, this was 2003, so this is dated, about 40% of the fisheries are overexploited. 32% have completely crashed. Only about 30% are being sustainably fished.